The elevator hummed its familiar tune as I watched the numbers climb: 22, 23, 24. Another Monday morning, another cup of coffee growing cold in my hand, another day of keeping my head down and doing the work. That's how I'd survived 3 years at Morrison and Associates, by being invisible, reliable, and completely unremarkable. I preferred it that way. The glass doors of the 25th floor gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and I could already see Patricia at reception checking her lipstick in her compact mirror. She gave me the same polite nod she'd been giving me for 3 years, the kind reserved for people whose names you know but whose lives don't matter enough to remember. "Morning, David," she said, not really looking at me. "Morning." My desk sat in the corner of the open plan office, positioned perfectly to see everything while being seen by no one. I'd requested it specifically, close enough to the senior partners' offices to be available when needed, far enough from the water cooler to avoid the daily gossip sessions that seemed to consume half the staff's energy. I was 3 emails into my morning routine when the murmur started. It began as a low buzz near the elevators, then spread like wildfire through the cubicles. Heads turned, conversations paused, and I found myself looking up despite my better judgment. Through the glass partition, I could see Mr. Morrison himself, a man who rarely graced us with his presence outside of quarterly meetings, walking purposefully toward the main office area. He wasn't alone. The man beside him was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and a smile that seemed designed to disarm. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, but there was something casual in the way he carried himself, like he was playing dress-up rather than dressing for work. I knew who he was before Patricia's voice crackled over the intercom. "David Chen to the conference room, please. David Chen to the conference room." My stomach dropped. I'd heard about Marcus Morrison in whispers and passing comments. The prodigal son who'd spent the last 5 years finding himself in Europe. The heir apparent who'd finally decided to grace the family business with his presence. The golden boy who'd never had to worry about proving himself because his last name was already on the building. As I walked toward the conference room, I caught fragments of conversation. "Can't believe he's actually starting here. Heard he was backpacking through Asia. Wonder if he'll last more than a month. Mr. Ibisaya, honey." Morrison was already seated at the head of the polished mahogany table when I entered, his son lounging in the chair beside him with a kind of ease that came from never having to worry about being fired. "David," Mr. Morrison said, standing to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet my son, Marcus. Marcus, this is David Chen, one of our most reliable analysts." Marcus stood, and when he extended his hand, I noticed his grip was firm, but not trying to prove anything. His eyes were green, the kind of green that made you think of deep forests and hidden things. "Nice to meet you," he said, and his voice was lower than I'd expected, rougher around the edges. "Likewise," I managed. "David, I'm assigning you to help Marcus get oriented over the next few weeks, show him the ropes, introduce him to our processes, help him understand how we operate here." The words hit me like a physical blow. Training the boss's son was exactly the kind of high-visibility assignment I'd spent 3 years avoiding. It meant attention, scrutiny, and the constant pressure of managing someone who could end my career with a single conversation at the family dinner table. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? "Excellent. Marcus, you'll be working closely with David on the Hartwell Industries acquisition. It's a complex deal, but I think it'll give you a good overview of our capabilities." Marcus nodded, still watching me with those unsettling green eyes. "Sounds perfect." After Mr. Morrison left, we stood in awkward silence for a moment. Marcus was studying me in a way that made me want to check if my tie was crooked or if I had something on my face. "So," he said finally, settling back into his chair. "David Chen, tell me something about yourself that's not on my father's briefing sheet." The question caught me off guard. "I'm sorry?" The briefing sheet. Top analyst, MBA from Wharton, 3 years with the firm, exemplary performance reviews. What else? I felt heat rise in my cheeks. There isn't much else. He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he wanted to solve. Everyone has something else. Not everyone, I said quietly. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of curiosity that made my chest tighten. Well, he said, standing and straightening his jacket, I guess I'll have to find out for myself. The next few days fell into an uncomfortable rhythm. Marcus was assigned a desk directly across from mine, a decision that felt deliberate and cruel. Every time I looked up from my computer, he was there, sometimes working, sometimes staring out the window, sometimes watching me with that same unsettling intensity. He was good at the work, I had to admit, faster than I'd expected, with an intuitive grasp of financial modeling that surprised me. But he was also distracting in ways I couldn't articulate. He had a habit of loosening his tie partway through the morning, rolling up his sleeves when he concentrated, running his hand through his hair when he was frustrated. I found myself noticing things I shouldn't notice. The way his brow furrowed when he was thinking, the unconscious way he bit his lower lip when he was reading, the fact that he drank his coffee black and ate lunch at his desk because he claimed the cafeteria was too loud. On Thursday afternoon, we were both hunched over spreadsheets when I felt eyes on me. I looked up to find Marcus watching me over his laptop screen, his chin resting on his folded hands. Our eyes met, and he didn't look away. The moment stretched between us like a held breath. I should have looked back at my work, should have pretended it didn't happen, should have done anything other than hold his gaze while something electric passed between us in the fluorescent-lit space. Is there something you need? I asked finally, my voice rougher than intended. Just watching you work, he said, still not looking away. You're very focused. It's called doing my job. Right. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Your job? I forced myself to look back at my screen, but I could still feel his eyes on me, could still feel that strange charge in the air between us. Friday evening, most of the office had emptied out by 6. I was still at my desk working through a complex valuation model for the Hartwell deal when Marcus appeared beside me. Still here? He asked. Just finishing up. It's almost 7. I glanced at the clock in the corner of my screen, surprised. I didn't realize. When was the last time you went home before 8? The question was casual, but something in his tone made me look up. He was standing closer than necessary, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made me think of leather and cedar. I don't keep track, I said. You should. Why? He shrugged, but his eyes were serious. Because there's more to life than work. Not for everyone. Especially for everyone. The elevator ride down was silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt heavy with things unsaid. We stood closer than we needed to. The elevator was empty, after all, and I found myself acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his body, the sound of his breathing, the way he kept glancing at me in the polished steel reflection of the doors. When we reached the lobby, he paused. Have dinner with me, he said. It wasn't really a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. It hung in the air between us, dangerous and tempting. I don't think that's appropriate, I said. Why not? We're colleagues. Colleagues have dinner. You're the boss's son. And you're the person training me. If anything, it's educational. I wanted to say yes. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to say yes to this man I barely knew, this man who represented everything I'd spent years avoiding. I wanted to sit across from him in some dimly lit restaurant and find out what made him laugh, what made him serious, what made him look at me like he was trying to see through to something hidden. Instead, I said, I have plans. It was a lie, and from the way his expression shifted, I think he knew it. Another time then, he said, but something had changed in his voice, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. I watched him walk away through the glass lobby doors, hands in his pockets, and told myself I'd made the right choice. The Hartwell Industries deal consumed the next week. Marcus and I were paired on every aspect of the analysis, which meant long hours hunched over financial statements, conference calls with lawyers and accountants, and late nights in the office when the rest of the world had gone home. It was during one of these late nights that I began to see him differently. We were in conference room B, papers spread across the mahogany table like a war map, takeout containers scattered between us. It was past 10 and Marcus had loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and messed up his hair until it stuck up in dark tufts. He looked younger this way, less polished, more real. "These numbers don't make sense," he said, staring at a spreadsheet with the kind of intensity I usually reserve for unsolvable problems. "Which ones?" "The quarterly projections for their European division. Look." He slid the paper across the table, and when I leaned forward to look, our shoulders brushed. Neither of us moved away. He was right. The numbers were inconsistent, hiding something that could sink the entire deal. "Good catch," I said, and meant it. "You sound surprised." I looked at him then, really looked at him. His eyes were tired, but there was something sharp there, something I'd missed before. "Maybe I am. Because I'm the boss's son who spent 5 years finding himself in Europe? Because that's what everyone says." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "What do you think?" It was a dangerous question, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. "I think you're more complicated than people give you credit for." "So are you." The words hung between us, and I found myself caught in his gaze again, that same electric feeling from before crackling in the space between us. "We should get back to work," I said. "Should we?" "Yes." But neither of us moved. It was Marcus who broke the moment, reaching for a file folder at the same time I did. Our hands collided over the manila tab, his fingers brushing against mine in a touch that lasted a second too long. I should have pulled away immediately, should have made some joke about being clumsy, should have created distance, should have done anything other than let my fingers linger against his while something hot and dangerous unfurled in my chest. But I didn't pull away, and neither did he. We sat there in the quiet conference room, hands touching over a file folder full of financial projections, and I felt something shift inside me, a wall I'd spent years building starting to crack. "David," he said quietly, and my name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow, more intimate. "We should. I know what we should do." But he still didn't move his hand. The moment stretched between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic 25 floors below, the thundering of my own heartbeat. Finally, I pulled my hand away. "It's late," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he agreed, but he was still looking at me with those green eyes that seemed to see too much. "It is." The next few days were torture. Every interaction felt charged with the memory of that almost moment in the conference room. Marcus seemed to be everywhere, bringing me coffee I didn't ask for, staying late when I stayed late, finding excuses to lean over my shoulder and point at something on my screen while his breath warmed the side of my neck. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was reading too much into casual gestures and professional courtesy, that the boss's son was just being friendly to the person training him, nothing more. But then there were moments that felt like anything but professional courtesy. Like when I was working alone in my cubicle on a Tuesday afternoon, and I looked up to find him watching me from across the office. When our eyes met, he didn't look away, didn't pretend to be doing something else. He just watched me with an expression I couldn't read, and I felt that familiar heat rise in my chest. Or the elevator ride on Wednesday morning when a mechanical issue left us stopped between floors for 20 minutes. We stood in opposite corners at first, making polite conversation about the weather and the Hartwell deal, but as the minutes ticked by, the space seemed to shrink around us. "You don't like me very much, do you?" he said suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "What makes you say that? You're always so careful around me, like you're afraid I might bite." "I'm careful around everyone." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not like this. With everyone else, you're polite, but distant. With me, you're something else, something I can't figure out." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. "It's okay," he continued, his voice softer now. "I make people nervous. The boss's son thing, I get it. People don't know how to act around me. It's not that. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I saw something shift in his expression. Then what is it? I looked at him, really looked at him, standing there in his perfectly tailored suit with his hair falling into his eyes and that expression of genuine curiosity on his face, and I felt something crack inside my chest. "You're dangerous," I said quietly. "Dangerous how?" But before I could answer, the elevator lurched back to life, and the moment was broken. It was the following Thursday when everything changed. We were working late again, the office empty except for the security guards and the cleaning crew. The Hartwell deal was in its final stages, and we'd been poring over due diligence reports for hours trying to identify any last-minute red flags. Marcus had shed his jacket hours ago, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. There was a smudge of ink on his left hand from a pen that had leaked, and his hair was messy from running his fingers through it. He looked nothing like the polished prince who'd walked into the office 3 weeks ago. "Why do you work so hard?" he asked suddenly. The question came out of nowhere, breaking the comfortable silence we'd fallen into. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's almost midnight, and you're still here. You're always here. Even when you don't have to be, even when no one would notice if you left early. Why?" I stared at the spreadsheet on my laptop screen, the numbers blurring together. It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself for years without finding a satisfactory answer. "Because I don't know who I am without it," I said finally. The honesty surprised me. I hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to give him that piece of myself. He was quiet for a long moment, and when I looked up, he was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, something soft and understanding and dangerously intimate. "Maybe I want to find out who you are when you stop," he said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow. There was something in his voice, something in the way he was looking at me, that made my chest tight and my breathing shallow. "Marcus, I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know we shouldn't. I know all the reasons why this is a bad idea, but I can't stop thinking about you." I should have said something professional, should have reminded him about workplace policies and the fact that his father was my boss and all the ways this could destroy my career, should have put distance between us, should have left the office, should have done anything other than sit there staring at him while my heart hammered against my ribs. Instead, I said, "I can't stop thinking about you either." The admission hung between us like a confession, dangerous and irreversible. Marcus stood slowly, his chair rolling back from the table, and walked around to where I was sitting. I turned to face him, my heart racing, and he stopped just close enough that I could feel the heat from his body. "David," he said, and my name sounded like a prayer in his voice. "This is insane," I whispered. "I know. You're the boss's son. I know. If anyone finds out, I know," he said again, and then he reached out and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. "I know all of that, but right now, in this moment, I don't care." I closed my eyes and leaned into his touch, and for the first time in 3 years, I let myself want something I shouldn't have. We didn't cross any lines that night, not technically, but something fundamental had shifted between us. Some invisible barrier had been crossed. We sat in that empty conference room until almost 2 in the morning talking about things that had nothing to do with work. I learned that Marcus had spent those 5 years in Europe not just finding himself, but working in hostels and coffee shops, trying to figure out who he was when he wasn't Morrison's son. I learned that he'd come back not because he wanted to, but because he felt obligated to, because sometimes duty was stronger than desire. He learned that I'd grown up poor, that my parents had sacrificed everything to send me to college, that I worked so hard because I was terrified of going back to having nothing. He learned that I'd never traveled anywhere, never taken a vacation, never done anything spontaneous or reckless in my entire adult life. "That's sad," he said, but not in a pitying way, just matter of fact, like he was stating an observable truth. "It's practical." "It's sad," he repeated. "When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" I thought about it, really thought about it, and couldn't come up with an answer. "See," he said softly, "sad." We walked to the elevator together, and this time the silence felt different, charged with possibility rather than tension. When we reached the lobby, he turned to me. "Have dinner with me," he said. "Not as colleagues, not as part of your training responsibilities, just have dinner with me." I looked at him standing there in the empty lobby, his tie loose around his neck, his eyes hopeful and vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. "Okay," I said. We had dinner the next night at a small Italian place in the village, the kind of restaurant that was too intimate for colleagues and too casual for business. Marcus had changed out of his suit into dark jeans and a button-down shirt that made his eyes look even greener, and I felt underdressed in my khakis and polo shirt until he smiled at me across the table like I was exactly what he'd been hoping to see. "You look different," he said as we waited for our food to arrive. "Different how?" "Relaxed, less like you're waiting for someone to tell you you're doing something wrong." I laughed despite myself. "Is that how I always look?" "A little bit, yeah." The conversation flowed easier than I'd expected. Away from the office, Marcus was funnier, more self-deprecating, more real. He told me stories about his time in Berlin, working in a hostel and learning German from drunk backpackers. I found myself telling him about my childhood in Queens, about the tiny apartment I'd shared with my parents and grandmother, about the scholarship that had changed everything. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Being close to your family?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But they're proud of what I've accomplished. That's worth something." "Is it worth everything?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. "I don't know," I said honestly. When he walked me back to my apartment, a studio in Murray Hill that cost more than my parents' mortgage, we lingered on the sidewalk outside my building. "I had a good time tonight," he said. So did I. "Good enough to do it again?" I looked at him standing there under the streetlight, hands in his pockets, and felt that familiar crack in my chest widening. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. I can't lose this job. I can't afford to take risks." "I understand." "Do you? Because this," I gestured between us, "this is the biggest risk I could possibly take." He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "What if it's worth it?" he said quietly. "What if it's not? Then we'll figure it out together." He leaned forward, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me right there on the sidewalk. But instead he pressed his lips to my cheek, a gesture so gentle and unexpected that it took my breath away. "Good night, David," he whispered against my ear. I watched him walk away until he disappeared around the corner, then stood there on the empty sidewalk for another 10 minutes, touching my cheek where his lips had been. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm. Days in the office were professional, careful, full of stolen glances and moments that lasted a second too long. But evenings became something else entirely. We had dinner twice more, once at a Thai place in Chinatown where Marcus insisted on trying to use chopsticks despite being terrible at it, once at a wine bar in Soho where we talked until they politely told us they were closing. We went to a movie on a Wednesday night, some foreign film that Marcus picked because he said I needed more culture in my life. I spent most of the 2 hours acutely aware of his presence beside me in the dark theater, the way he laughed at parts that weren't supposed to be funny, the way he kept glancing at me during the dramatic scenes like he was checking my reaction. We walked through Central Park on a Saturday afternoon, and Marcus bought us hot dogs from a vendor and insisted on feeding the ducks, even though there were signs saying not to. When a park ranger told him to stop, he smiled so charmingly that she ended up giving him her number instead of a ticket. "You do that a lot," I said as we walked away. "What?" "Charm your way out of trouble," he shrugged. "It's a useful skill." "Must be nice." "What must be nice?" "Being the kind of person people like automatically. People see you and they want to help you, want to be around you. They see me and they think responsible employee, good for making copies and staying late." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face me. "Is that really what you think?" "It's what I know." "Then you don't know how you look when you're concentrating on something complicated. You don't know how your whole face changes when you're explaining something you're passionate about." You don't know that you have this little line between your eyebrows when you're worried, or that you bite your lower lip when you're trying not to laugh at something inappropriate. I stared at him, surprised by the specificity of his observations. You notice all that? I notice everything about you, he said quietly. I can't help it. It was a Tuesday night in late October when we stayed in the office past midnight again. Most of the senior partners were traveling, and the place felt different after hours. Quieter, more intimate, like a secret we were sharing. We'd been working on a new acquisition, something smaller than Hartwell, but no less complex. Marcus had proven himself over the past month, earning grudging respect from even the most skeptical associates. But tonight he seemed distracted. Everything okay? I asked during a break in our analysis. Define okay. I looked at him across the conference table. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, and there was something in his expression I couldn't read. You seem, I don't know, different tonight. Different how? Like you're somewhere else. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers spread between us. When he finally looked up, his eyes were serious in a way I'd rarely seen. Can I tell you something? Of course. I've been thinking about that night, the first night we stayed late together, when I asked you why you work so hard. I remembered. Of course I remembered. I remembered every word of that conversation, every moment of that night. What about it? You said you don't know who you are without work, but I think you do know. I think you're just scared to find out. The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, you're scared that if you stop being the perfect employee, the reliable one, the one who never makes waves, you'll disappear. But what if the opposite is true? What if you'd finally become visible? I stared at him, my chest tight. This isn't about work. No, he said quietly. It's not. Then what is it about? It's about the fact that I'm falling in love with you, and I think you're falling in love with me too, but you're too scared to admit it because it doesn't fit into your careful, controlled life. The words hung between us like a challenge. I felt something crack open inside my chest, something I'd been holding closed for weeks. You can't just say things like that, I whispered. Why not? Because, I struggled to find the words, because this is real life, Marcus. This isn't some romantic movie where everything works out perfectly. This is real life, where people like me don't get people like you, where office romances destroy careers, where the boss's son doesn't fall for the boring analyst in the corner cubicle. People like you? His voice was sharp now, almost angry. What does that mean, people like you? You know what it means. No, I don't. Explain it to me. I looked at him sitting there with his expensive suit and his perfect hair and his easy confidence, and I felt the weight of every difference between us. People like me are careful, I said finally. We follow rules, we don't take risks, we don't get fairy tale endings. And people like me? People like you get whatever you want. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, and I felt like I'd said something unforgivable. Is that really what you think? He said finally. That I'm just some spoiled rich kid who's amusing himself with the office drone? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over the city. You want to know what people like me get, David? We get everything handed to us except the thing we want most. We get money and connections and opportunities, but we don't get to choose who we are. We don't get to earn anything for ourselves. We don't get to be seen for who we really are instead of what our last name represents. I watched him standing there with his back to me, silhouetted against the city lights, and felt something shift inside my chest. Do you want to know why I really came back? He continued, his voice quieter now. It wasn't duty. It wasn't obligation. It was because I was tired of being nobody. In Berlin, in Prague, in all those places where no one knew my name, I was just another American with a backpack, just another face in the crowd. And for a while that was exactly what I wanted. But then I realized that being nobody isn't the same as being free. It's just another kind of prison. He turned back to face me, and I could see something raw and vulnerable in his expression. I came back because I thought maybe, finally, I could figure out how to be somebody real. Somebody who mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with my father's company. And then I met you. Marcus, you look at me like I'm a person, not a position. You challenge me. You make me want to be better, smarter, more than just a name on a door. You make me feel like maybe I could earn something for myself, something that matters. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. You don't need to earn anything from me. Don't I? The question hung between us, and I realized that somewhere along the way, my careful walls had crumbled completely. This man, this complicated, vulnerable, impossible man, had somehow become essential to me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I'm scared, I admitted. Of what? Of wanting something this much. Of wanting you this much. He walked back to the table, but instead of sitting across from me, he came around to my side. When I looked up at him, he was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. What if we were both scared together? He said quietly. What if it ruins everything? What if it doesn't? He reached out and touched my face, the same gentle gesture he'd made weeks ago, and I leaned into his hand without thinking. David, he whispered. Yeah? I need you to know something. Whatever happens between us, however this ends, you're not invisible. Not to me. You never were. I closed my eyes and let myself feel the warmth of his palm against my cheek. Let myself want something I'd been denying for weeks. When I opened my eyes, he was still looking at me with that expression that made my chest ache, like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. He was the one person I should keep at a distance, I thought. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the room. Marcus, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah? I think I'm falling in love with you too. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, bright and warm and impossible to look away from. Yeah? He said. Yeah. He leaned closer, and I thought he might kiss me then, finally cross that last invisible line between us. But instead he rested his forehead against mine, and we stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, letting the weight of our confessions settle between us. What do we do now? I whispered. I don't know, he admitted. I've never done this before. Done what? Fallen in love with someone I could actually have. We didn't leave the office until almost 3 that morning. Not because we were working, the spreadsheets and reports lay forgotten on the conference table, but because neither of us wanted to break the spell that had settled over us. We talked about everything and nothing, about his time in Europe and my dreams of traveling, about books we'd read and movies we'd loved, about the future and whether it was possible to build something real out of stolen moments and whispered confessions. When we finally did leave, Marcus walked me to the subway station even though it was completely out of his way. We stood at the top of the stairs, commuters rushing past us, and I felt like we were in our own private bubble. I should go, I said, but I didn't move. You should, he agreed, but he didn't step back. This changes things. Everything. Are you okay with that? Are you? I looked at him standing there in the fluorescent light of the subway entrance, his hair messed up from running his fingers through it, his eyes tired but bright, and I felt something settle into place inside my chest. Ask me tomorrow, I said. I will. The next few days were simultaneously the best and worst of my life. Every moment in the office felt charged with electricity. Every accidental touch, every shared glance, every whispered conversation felt like we were walking a tightrope between professional propriety and something much more dangerous. Marcus started bringing me coffee in the mornings. Not the terrible office coffee, but real coffee from the place around the corner that cost $6 a cup. He'd set it on my desk without saying anything, but when I looked up to thank him, he'd be watching me with that soft expression that made my heart race. We found excuses to work together on projects that didn't require both of us. We stayed late when we didn't need to, ordered dinner to the office when we could have gone home. We created a world within a world, a space where we could be almost honest about what was happening between us. But it was torture, too. Every moment of wanting him and not being able to touch him. Every conversation that had to stay professional when all I wanted was to talk about the way he looked when he concentrated, or how his laugh made something warm unfurl in my chest, or the fact that I'd started looking forward to Monday mornings for the first time in my adult life. It was Friday evening when everything came to a head. Most of the office had cleared out by 6, but Marcus and I were still there, ostensibly working on month-end reports, but really just finding reasons to stay in each other's orbit. The cleaning crew had come and gone, the security guards were making their rounds, and the building had settled into that quiet emptiness that made everything feel more intimate. We were in my cubicle. Marcus had dragged a chair over from someone else's desk and was sitting closer than necessary, pretending to look at the numbers on my screen when we both knew he'd memorized them hours ago. "These projections still don't look right," he said, but his voice was distracted, and when I glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the screen at all. He was looking at me. "They're fine," I said quietly. "Are they?" The question had nothing to do with spreadsheets, and we both knew it. I turned in my chair to face him fully, and suddenly we were closer than we'd ever been in the office. Close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his tie had been loosened just enough to show the hollow of his throat. "Marcus," I said, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "We should go," he said, but he didn't move. "We should." "David?" "Yeah? Can I tell you something?" I nodded. "I've never wanted anything the way I want this, the way I want you, and it terrifies me." The honesty in his voice made my chest tight. "Why?" "Because I don't know how to want something I might not be able to have." I looked at him sitting there in the empty office, surrounded by the detritus of another 12-hour day, and felt something break open inside me. "What if you could have it?" I whispered. "What if I couldn't? What if we stopped asking what if?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see something shifting in his expression, some internal wall coming down. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "Where?" "Just come with me." He stood and walked toward the windows that lined the far wall of the office, the ones that looked out over the city. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs, not sure what we were doing but unable to stop myself. The view from the 25th floor was spectacular at night. The city spread out below us like a constellation, all light and movement and endless possibility. Marcus stood with his back to the glass, hands in his pockets, and when I stopped in front of him, we were close enough that anyone walking by could see us, but there was no one to see. Just us and the empty office and the weight of everything we'd been holding back. "David," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice, softer, more urgent. "Yeah?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him working up the courage to say something that would change everything between us. "If I kissed you right now," he said quietly, "would you stop me?" The question hung in the air between us like a held breath. The hum of the city beyond the window, the distant sound of traffic 25 floors below, the thundering of my own heartbeat. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I closed the space between us. Part 2. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined, and I had imagined it, more times than I cared to admit, in quiet moments when my defenses were down and I let myself want something I thought I could never have. It was slow, uncertain, more question than answer. His lips were softer than I'd expected, and he tasted like coffee and something else I couldn't identify, something that was just him. When he brought his hand up to cup my face, his fingers were trembling. We broke apart after what felt like seconds and hours at the same time, but we didn't step back. We stayed there, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff with my eyes closed. "Jesus," he whispered against my lips. "Marcus, I know we shouldn't. I know all the reasons why this is insane. But I don't care anymore." He kissed me again, and this time it was different, less hesitant, more sure. I felt myself melting into him, my hands finding the front of his shirt, pulling him closer until there was no space left between us. When we finally broke apart again, we were both breathing hard. You're the first person who's ever made me quiet, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him confused. What do you mean? I mean my brain never stops. It's always going, always planning, always performing. Even when I was in Europe, even when I was trying to be nobody, it never stopped. But when I'm with you, when you look at me like that, it just goes quiet. I felt something crack open in my chest. You're the first person who's made me want to speak. What do you mean? I mean I've spent my whole life keeping quiet, keeping my head down, not making waves, not saying what I really think or feel. But with you, I want to tell you everything. I want to tell you things I've never told anyone. He smiled, and it was soft and vulnerable, and nothing like the charming grin he wore for everyone else. Tell me something now, he said. Like what? Anything, something true. I looked at him standing there against the window, city lights creating a halo around his dark hair, and felt brave in a way I'd never felt before. I used to think love was something that happened to other people, I said. Something I'd read about or see in movies but never experienced for myself. I thought I was too careful, too boring, too afraid to ever feel something that big. And now? Now I think I was just waiting for the right person to be afraid of losing. Something shifted in his expression, something soft and wondering. David, I'm not done, I said quickly before I lost my nerve. I need you to know that us, it's not just about you being attractive or charming or any of the things that make people want to be around you. It's about the way you look when you're thinking through a complex problem. It's about how you remember things I tell you in passing. It's about the fact that you see me, really see me, in a way no one else ever has. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Can I tell you something? He said finally. Of course. I've never been in love before, not really. I've been infatuated. I've been attracted. I've been in relationships that looked like love from the outside. But I've never felt like this, like someone could reach inside my chest and rearrange everything I thought I knew about myself. Is that what this feels like? Yeah, he said quietly. That's exactly what this feels like. We stood there looking at each other, and I felt like we were standing at the beginning of something that would either save us or destroy us completely. What do we do now? I asked. I don't know, he admitted. I've never been here before. Neither have I. Should we be terrified? Probably. Are you? I thought about it honestly. Yes, but not of you. I'm terrified of what this could cost me. I'm terrified of what happens if your father finds out. I'm terrified of losing everything I've worked for. And I'm terrified of hurting you, he said. I'm terrified of being the reason you lose something you care about. I'm terrified that I'm too selfish to walk away even though I should. Don't, I said quickly. Don't what? Don't walk away. Not unless you want to. Don't make that choice for me. He studied my face, and I could see him weighing something in his mind. What if this ruins your career? What if it doesn't? What if people find out? What if they don't? What if my father— Marcus, I interrupted, reaching out to touch his arm. What if we stop living in the what-ifs and start living in the what-is? And what is this? I looked at him, really looked at him, standing there in his rumpled shirt with his hair falling into his eyes and his expression open and vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. This is me falling in love with someone I shouldn't fall in love with, I said. This is you making me want things I've never wanted before. This is us standing in an empty office at midnight, trying to figure out how to be honest about something that could change everything. And? And I don't want to be careful anymore. I don't want to spend my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try. He smiled, and it was different from any smile I'd seen from him before, smaller, more real, like it was just for me. Come here, he said softly. I stepped closer and he reached for my hands, intertwining our fingers. His hands were warm and slightly rough, and I wondered absently what they'd been doing during those 5 years in Europe that had given them calluses. I want to try, he said. I want to try being brave with you. Even if it's complicated? Especially if it's complicated. He pulled me closer and we kissed again, softer this time, like we had all the time in the world. When we broke apart, he didn't let go of my hands. "We should probably get out of here," he said. Probably, but neither of us moved. "In a minute," he said. "In a minute." We walked back toward my desk to gather our things, and I was acutely aware of how different everything felt. The same fluorescent lights, the same gray cubicles, the same view of the city, but all of it transformed by what had just happened between us. Marcus helped me pack up my laptop and files, and there was something domestic about it that made my chest tight. Like we were a couple going home after a long day instead of two people who had just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. "Hey," he said as I was sliding my laptop into my bag. "Yeah? Thank you." "For what?" "For not stopping me." I looked at him and felt that same electric charge that had been building between us for weeks. "Thank you for asking." We took the elevator down together, standing closer than colleagues should, our hands brushing as we both reached for the button panel at the same time. The touch sent electricity shooting up my arm, and from the way Marcus's breath caught, I think he felt it too. "This is going to be harder than I thought," he said quietly. "What is?" "Acting normal around you." I knew exactly what he meant. Everything had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to go back to professional distance and polite conversation when all I wanted was to reach out and touch him. "We'll figure it out," I said. "Will we?" "We have to." The elevator reached the lobby, and we stepped out into the marble and glass space that felt cavernous after the intimacy of the empty office upstairs. Our footsteps echoed as we walked toward the exit, and I was hyper-aware of the space between us, close enough to touch, far enough to maintain plausible deniability. Outside, the November air was sharp and cold, and I pulled my coat tighter around myself. Marcus had his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and when he looked at me, I could see our breath forming clouds in the space between us. "Which way are you going?" he asked. "Subway's that way," I said, pointing east. "I'll walk with you." "You don't have to." "I want to." We walked in comfortable silence for a few blocks, close enough that our shoulders bumped occasionally, far enough apart that anyone seeing us would think we were just colleagues heading home after a late night. But I was acutely aware of him beside me, the way he walked with his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, the way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way the streetlights caught in his hair and made shadows on his face. "David," he said as we reached the subway entrance. "Yeah? Are you okay? With what happened up there?" I looked at him standing there in the pool of light from the street lamp, his expression serious and slightly worried, and felt something settle into place in my chest. "More than okay," I said. "Good," he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable, because I was starting to panic that maybe I'd pushed too hard, moved too fast. "You didn't." "No?" "No, if anything, you were too patient." "Too patient?" "I've been wanting you to kiss me for weeks." The admission slipped out before I could stop it, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks despite the cold air. Marcus stared at me, and then he laughed. Not the polished, charming laugh he used in the office, but something real and surprised and delighted. "Weeks?" he said. "Maybe longer." "Jesus, David," and here I was thinking I was the one being obvious. "You were obvious. So were you." "I was not." "You were. The way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't paying attention, the way you'd get flustered when I stood too close, the way you'd find excuses to stay late when I was staying late." I stared at him. "You knew?" "I hoped," he said softly, "but I wasn't sure until tonight." "What made you sure?" "The way you didn't pull away when our hands touched over that file folder, the way you looked at me when I asked if you'd stop me, the way you kissed me back like you meant it." "I did mean it." "Good," he said, "because I meant it too." We stood there looking at each other, and I felt like we were in our own private bubble despite being on a busy street corner with people rushing past us to catch trains and buses. "I should go," I said finally. "You should." but neither of us moved. Marcus? Yeah? What happens on Monday? The question hung between us, loaded with all the complications we'd been trying not to think about. I don't know, he said honestly, but we'll figure it out. Together. Together. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me again right there on the street corner. But instead he reached out and squeezed my hand once, quickly, a touch that lasted barely a second but felt like a promise. "Good night, David," he said. "Good night." I watched him walk away until he disappeared into the crowd of late-night commuters, then stood there for another few minutes before finally heading down into the subway. The train ride back to my apartment passed in a blur. I kept replaying the evening in my head, the way Marcus had looked at me before he asked if he could kiss me, the softness of his lips, the way he'd said my name like it meant something precious. He wasn't just the boss's son anymore. He was someone I could fall for and someone I could lose everything for. The thought should have terrified me more than it did. 3 hours ago, the idea of risking my career for a relationship would have been unthinkable. But sitting on the subway with the taste of Marcus still on my lips, it felt less like a risk and more like an inevitability. My apartment felt smaller when I got home, like the walls had moved closer together while I was gone. I went through the motions of getting ready for bed, shower, brush teeth, set alarm for Monday morning. But my mind was still back in that empty office, replaying every word, every touch, every moment of connection. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself to go to sleep when my phone buzzed with a text message. I almost didn't check it. It was past 1 in the morning and the only people who texted me this late were work contacts with emergencies, but something made me reach for the phone. The message was from Marcus. "You didn't stop me." I stared at the words on the screen and felt something warm unfurl in my chest. It wasn't a question or a statement of fact, it was acknowledgement, recognition, a quiet celebration of the choice I'd made. I started to type a response 3 different times, then deleted each attempt. What could I say that would capture everything I was feeling? How could I put into words the way my entire world had shifted in the space of a single kiss? Finally, I settled on something simple. I didn't want to. His response came almost immediately. "Good. Sleep well, David." "You too." I set the phone aside and closed my eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. I kept thinking about Monday, about walking into the office and seeing Marcus across the room and trying to act like nothing had changed when everything had changed. I thought about the way he'd looked at me when he said I was the first person to make him quiet, about the honesty in his voice when he'd admitted he'd never been in love before, about the way he'd asked if I'd stop him like my answer was the most important thing in the world. And I thought about what came next. Because this was just the beginning, the first page of a story I had no idea how to write. We'd crossed one line tonight, but there were so many others waiting. Professional boundaries and family complications, and the simple, terrifying reality of building something real with someone who could destroy my career with a word to his father. But lying there in the dark, thinking about the way Marcus had smiled when I said I'd been wanting him to kiss me for weeks, I found that the terror was accompanied by something else. Hope. Maybe this would be a disaster. Maybe we'd crash and burn spectacularly, taking my carefully constructed life down with us. But maybe, just maybe, we'd figure out how to be brave together, how to build something worth the risk. I fell asleep thinking about green eyes and gentle hands and the way it felt to be seen, really seen, for the first time in my life. Saturday morning came too early, dragging me out of dreams that felt more real than my empty apartment. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that the previous night had actually happened. But the memory of Marcus's lips against mine was too vivid to be imagination, and when I checked my phone, his text messages were still there, proof that it hadn't all been some elaborate fantasy. "You didn't stop me." I read the words again and felt that same warm flutter in my chest that I'd felt the night before. He was right. I hadn't stopped him. And more than that, and I didn't regret not stopping him. Even in the cold light of morning, with all the potential complications staring me in the face, I couldn't bring myself to wish it hadn't happened. I made coffee and tried to grade papers. I'd been taking night classes toward my CPA certification, another step in my carefully planned career trajectory, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to that moment by the window when Marcus had asked his question and I'd answered by closing the space between us. Around noon, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw Marcus's name on the screen. What if he was calling to tell me he'd made a mistake? What if the reality of what we'd done had sunk in and he'd realized how much we both had to lose? "Hello?" I said, and hated how uncertain my voice sounded. "Hey," he said, and the warmth in his voice immediately eased the knot of anxiety in my chest. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "It's noon." "Right. I wasn't sure if you were a sleep-in on weekends person." "I'm not really a sleep-in person at all." "No, I didn't think you would be." There was a pause, and then, "How are you feeling? About last night?" The question was carefully neutral, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath it. He was as nervous as I realized, as afraid that the other person might have second thoughts. "Terrified," I said honestly, "but not sorry." "Good," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Because I was lying awake all night thinking about it, and I couldn't decide if I should apologize or ask if I could see you today. "What did you decide?" "That I definitely shouldn't apologize." "And seeing me today?" "I want to," he said. "But I also don't want to push. I know this is complicated, and I know you need time to process." I looked around my small apartment, at the stack of papers I wasn't grading, at the breakfast dishes I hadn't washed, at the careful, controlled life I'd built for myself, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "What did you have in mind?" I said. We met at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which felt appropriately neutral in public. Marcus was waiting for me on the steps, hands shoved in his coat pockets, looking up at the imposing facade of the building. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said when he saw me approaching. "I wasn't sure I would either." "But you did." "But I did." We looked at each other for a moment, and I felt some of the tension from the morning start to ease. He looked different in daylight, more relaxed than he ever did in the office. He was wearing dark jeans and a gray sweater instead of his usual suit, and his hair was slightly messy, like he'd been running his fingers through it. "Have you been here before?" he asked as we climbed the steps together. "A few times. You?" "Not since I was a kid. My mother used to bring me here when she wanted to get away from my father's business dinners." It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother, and I found myself curious. But before I could ask, we were inside the vast marble lobby, and the conversation shifted to which exhibits we wanted to see. We wandered through the Egyptian wing first, making polite conversation about sarcophagi and hieroglyphics, carefully maintaining the distance of acquaintances rather than whatever we were now. But gradually, as we moved through the galleries, the awkwardness began to fade. "Look at this," Marcus said, stopping in front of a small painting in the European collection. It was a Vermeer, a woman reading a letter by a window, light streaming across her face. "It's beautiful," I said. "My mother had a print of this in her study. I used to stare at it when I was supposed to be doing homework." "What did you see in it?" He was quiet for a moment, studying the painting. "Peace, I think. The woman looks so content, like she's exactly where she's supposed to be." "Do you feel like that? Like you're where you're supposed to be?" He looked at me then, and something passed between us that had nothing to do with art. "I'm starting to," he said quietly. We moved through the American wing after that, and I found myself watching Marcus as much as the art. The way he stopped in front of certain paintings, really looking at them instead of just glancing and moving on. The way he read every placard, absorbing information like he was storing it for later. The way he occasionally pointed out details I would have missed. The way light fell across a subject's hands, the expression in someone's eyes. "You know a lot about art," I observed as we paused in front of a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. "I spent a lot of time in museums in Europe." When you're traveling alone, they're good places to go when you want to be around people, but not have to talk to anyone. Were you lonely? The question slipped out before I could stop it, too personal for whatever careful boundary we were trying to maintain. But Marcus didn't seem to mind. Sometimes, he said. But it was a different kind of lonely than I'd been before. It was chosen, I guess. Instead of feeling lonely in a room full of people who knew my name but not me. And now? Now I'm not sure what I am. We'd stopped walking, standing in front of the O'Keefe while museum visitors flowed around us. Marcus was looking at me instead of the painting, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. Marcus? I know, he said quietly. I know we're supposed to be taking this slow, figuring things out. But I can't stop thinking about last night. About the way you looked at me when I asked if you'd stop me. How did I look at you? Like you'd been waiting for me to ask. The words hung between us, and I felt something shift in the careful distance we'd been maintaining. Maybe I had been, I said. Yeah? Yeah. He smiled, and it was soft and private, and meant just for me. Come on, he said. Let's get out of here. We walked through Central Park afterward, taking the long way around the reservoir even though the November air was sharp and cold. The trees were mostly bare, their branches creating intricate patterns against the gray sky, and there were fewer people out than there would have been on a warmer day. Can I ask you something? Marcus said as we walked. Of course. What scares you most about this? About us? It was the question I'd been avoiding thinking about, even though it had been lurking in the back of my mind since the moment he'd kissed me. Losing control, I said finally. Of what? Everything. My job, my reputation, my future. I've worked so hard to build something stable, something secure, and this, us, it threatens all of that. Does it? You know it does. Your father is my boss, Marcus. If this goes wrong, if we get caught, if you decide you're bored with me in 6 months. Hey, he said, stopping walking and turning to face me. Look at me. I looked at him and saw something serious and determined in his expression. I'm not going to get bored with you, he said. I can't promise you a lot of things. I can't promise this will be easy or that there won't be complications or that my father will react well if he finds out. But I can promise you that this isn't some whim for me. This isn't me amusing myself with the office analyst. How can you be so sure? Because I've never felt like this before. Because you make me want to be better than I am. Because when I'm with you, I feel like the person I've been trying to become for the past 5 years. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tight. Marcus, what scares you? I asked, because I needed to know that I wasn't the only one taking a risk. Hurting you, he said without hesitation. I'm scared that I'll be selfish, that I'll want you more than I care about what it costs you. I'm scared that I'll mess this up the way I've messed up everything else in my life. You haven't messed up everything, haven't I? I spent 5 years running away from responsibility, from my family, from anything that mattered. I came back because I thought I was ready to be an adult, but what if I'm not? What if I'm still just a spoiled kid who wants something he can't have? I looked at him standing there in the middle of the park, his hair ruffled by the wind, his expression vulnerable and uncertain, and felt something fierce and protective rise in my chest. You're not a spoiled kid, I said. How do you know? Because a spoiled kid wouldn't care about hurting me. A spoiled kid wouldn't have spent 5 years trying to figure out who he was without his father's name. A spoiled kid wouldn't have asked if I'd stop him. He would have just taken what he wanted. Marcus stared at me, and I could see something shifting in his expression. You really believe that? I really believe that. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough that anyone watching would know we were more than friends. David, he said quietly. Yeah? Can I tell you something else that scares me? Of course. I'm scared that I'm falling in love with you faster than I should, harder than I should. I'm scared that I'm going to want things from you that you're not ready to give. What kind of things? Everything, he said simply. I want to know what you look like when you wake up in the morning. I want to know what makes you laugh, really laugh, not just the polite laugh you do in the office. I want to take you places you've never been and watch you experience things for the first time. I want to be the person you call when you have good news or bad news or no news at all. Each word hit me like a small shock, and I felt my carefully constructed walls crumbling a little more. That scares you, I said. Terrifies me, because I've never wanted those things with anyone before, and I don't know how to want them without wanting them completely. I looked at him and felt something settle into place in my chest, a certainty I hadn't expected to feel so soon. What if I want those things too? I said quietly. Do you? I think I do. And that terrifies me more than losing my job or disappointing your father or any of the other things I've been worried about. Why? Because wanting something that much gives it the power to destroy you. He smiled, soft and understanding. Or save you. Or save you, I agreed. We stood there looking at each other while joggers and dog walkers passed by around us, and I felt like we were making some kind of pact, acknowledging the risk we were taking while agreeing to take it anyway. So what do we do now? I asked. We take it one day at a time, he said. We figure out how to be together without destroying either of our lives. We try to be smart about this. And if we can't be smart about it, then we figure out how to be stupid together. I laughed and it felt good, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. Come on, Marcus said, taking my hand briefly before letting it go. I'll walk you home. The walk back to my apartment took twice as long as it should have because we kept stopping to look at things. Street art on building walls, dogs playing in small parks, the way the late afternoon light fell across the facades of brownstone buildings. It felt like we were seeing the city with new eyes, or maybe just seeing it together for the first time. When we reached my building, we lingered on the sidewalk the same way we had the night before. Thank you, I said, for today, for being patient with me while I figured this out. Thank you for letting me in, he said, for trusting me enough to try. Marcus? Yeah? What happens on Monday? It was the same question I'd asked the night before, but it felt different now. Less anxious, more practical. Monday, we go to work and act like professionals, he said. We focus on the Hartwell deal and the month-end reports and all the normal things we're supposed to focus on. And after work? After work, if you want, we can have dinner. We can talk about things that have nothing to do with spreadsheets and quarterly projections. We can figure out how to do this without putting either of us at risk. That sounds perfect. Does it? It does. He smiled and stepped closer. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me again, right there on the busy sidewalk in broad daylight, but instead he reached out and squeezed my hand once, the same quick private gesture he'd made the night before. I'll see you Monday, he said. See you Monday. I watched him walk away until he turned the corner and disappeared from sight, then stood there for another few minutes replaying the day in my mind. 24 hours ago, I'd been David Chen, reliable analyst, careful employee, person who followed rules and avoided complications. Now I was David Chen, person who was falling in love with his boss's son, person who was willing to risk everything he'd worked for because sometimes the thing you want most is worth more than the thing you're afraid to lose. The transformation should have been terrifying, and it was in some ways. But as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I felt fully awake. Sunday passed in a blur of restless energy. I tried to grade papers, tried to clean my apartment, tried to do all the normal weekend things I usually did to prepare for the week ahead, but I couldn't concentrate on anything except the thought of seeing Marcus again the next day. I kept picking up my phone to text him, then putting it down without sending anything. What would I say? That I missed him after less than 24 hours? That I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me in the museum? That I was equal parts excited and terrified about what we were building together? Around 8 that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from him. How's your Sunday going? Restless, I texted back. You? Same. Keep thinking about yesterday. Good thoughts or bad thoughts? Very good thoughts. I stared at the words on my screen and felt that familiar warmth spread through my chest. Marcus? Yeah? I'm glad you asked. Asked what? If I would stop you. There was a pause, and then, I'm glad you didn't. Me too. Sleep well, David. See you tomorrow. You too. I set the phone aside and finished getting ready for bed, but I felt lighter somehow, like the simple exchange of texts had eased some of the anxiety I'd been carrying about the day ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning how to work together professionally while navigating whatever was growing between us personally, figuring out how to be in the same room without everyone seeing what had changed, maintaining the careful boundaries that would keep us